Hello and welcome to Jeff the Mongoose Mystery. Today we have a topic that is quite strange, but also interesting in the same regards. Two of my viewers by the name of Billy Bonewhacker and Scyther Dracon requested this video quite some time ago, so thank you both for the suggestion. To be honest with you all, up until now, I never gave this topic too much thought, and I figured it would fit in with some video about random subject matters. In saying that, I mean no disrespect to those who suggested it, but it just seemed really odd. To see a story about a talking mongoose? That's strange even for me. However, I randomly started to look into it, and shockingly, I see there is a lot more to this than meets the eye. Just when I started to think I had this story figured out, something popped up that made me go back to the drawing board. This topic seems like it fits in with cryptids, but the more you look at it, the more it feels like it involves the spirit realm. So join me as we try to unravel this mystery and see if we can make any sense of it. Our story takes place on the Isle of Man in the 1930s. On a side note, I wish this would have been part of our Cryptid by Country videos, since it has some fascinating history. But it's not, so I won't go into it here. A 58-year-old retired door-to-door piano salesman named James T. Irving lived in an old farmhouse in the Cashin's Gap area, along with his 54-year-old wife Margaret and their 12-year-old daughter Viore. Times were rough on the family, but they made do with what they had. Their house was described as being a two-story stone structure with very few small windows allowing light inside. Speaking of the interior, the walls were covered in dark matchwood paneling which didn't fit correctly and allowed for a lot of space between the stone structure and the wood. Apparently, their quiet life was disturbed in 1931 by the unexpected presence of an unknown being that alerted the residents to his presence by knocking, scratching, and even making various animal sounds from the walls. After a while, this activity started to bother Margaret, and at one point she asked James, "What in the name of God can this be?" Without missing a beat, a high-pitched voice echoed back word for word what Margaret had just said. It was at this point that the family realized that what they were dealing with was something quite out of the ordinary. Following this event, the creature in the walls began to make its presence fairly well known. At first it mostly took to conversing with their daughter Viore, but then opened up to the rest of the family. You may think that this being was just trying to be friendly, but when reading about the encounter, it is quite obvious, at first, that wasn't the case. The creature would frequently berate the family, throw things at them, and even at one point made the statement that it could easily kill all of them, but was choosing not to. This activity frightened James since their daughter's room was so close to the part of the house that the being called its sanctuary. So at first he set up poison to kill it, but that didn't work. Then he chose to try to shoot it, but again failed. Although it should be noted that each time James tried to kill the creature, it retaliated with destroying parts of the house, and it kept the family awake by screaming like a banshee. Finally, James decided that their only recourse would be to move Viore into their bedroom, since they feared for her safety. It was then that the being stated that, "I'll follow her wherever you move her." After this statement, it isn't clear what caused the family to accept the being, but apparently they started to see it as a normal part of the household. It was during this time that the Irving family really got to know what this being was, due to everyone openly having conversations with it. According to most retellings, it claimed to be a spirit that was currently taking the form of a weasel-like creature. However, in the same story, it claimed to be an 83-year-old mongoose that came from India. Jeff then promised to never hurt any of the family members, and would in fact look over the house and protect Viore. This doesn't mean that Jeff was always nice to the family, since it would frequently tell them their house was terrible, and he had previously lived in much nicer ones. It also took to urinating out of the cracks in the walls, and would swear at and belittle the husband and wife. Outside of this, Jeff did try to make amends by frequently bringing the family dead rabbits that it had killed by strangulation, and would even chase mice away by mimicking a cat. In return, the family didn't try to hurt it and would leave food in the rafters of the house since Jeff liked to eat without being seen and enjoyed hanging around the ceiling. While it claimed to be a simple mongoose, it also stated it was powerful enough to split atoms and that it was from the fifth dimension, which alludes to it being more than just a flesh and blood creature. Even as such, the family didn't get an opportunity to actually see Jeff for quite some time. However, when they did, James claimed it looked like a mongoose that had yellow hair, a bushy tail with black speckles in it, its feet had 3 toes and 1 thumb, much like a hand, a pushed-in face, and was between 9 and 12 inches long. Very few people saw this being outside of the family, but here are 2 photographs that they claim to be of him, even though most think it just depicts a cat. I should note that the family and some guests claimed to at times see Jeff crawling around on the ceiling also. That's a little bit unnerving. According to an interview with Viore many years later, her and her mother didn't want to share this story, but her father was extremely interested in telling anyone who would listen. Due to this, many visitors such as paranormal investigators, the curious, and the media showed up at the door frequently. For a time, Jeff would talk to these guests, and one of his favorite tricks was to peer an eyeball through a hole in the ceiling and call if a guest was going to get heads or tails if they flipped a coin. Over time, Jeff became cautious of new visitors and did refuse to show itself, but then would resume speaking after they left. With most accounts, Jeff was fearful that one of these people would try to capture him and put him in a bottle. That exact phrase was mentioned quite frequently throughout the encounters. Jeff wasn't so much afraid of death, since it was once asked about it and simply called it a changeover, but it did fear being put in a bottle, which makes me wonder something that I'll get to later. Visitors had one of 3 impressions after leaving, and that is, it was real, that Viore was using ventriloquism to cause the voice, or that they could neither prove nor disprove it. To this point, I would think that it was simply a hoax, but then we find more strange information that leaves me scratching my head. At one point, James went into town to have lunch with a friend named Captain M.H. McDonald. During this venture, the two had many discussions, including things about Margaret, and even at one point James bought his wife flowers to bring back. Once James returned, he was greeted by Margaret, who questioned him about their conversation, and stated Jeff had followed the men and returned home to give her the information. Jeff also took to spying on neighbors, and returned to regale the family with private information that no one could have known if they weren't in those households. Not only this, but apparently Jeff would throw heavy furniture if he was mad, and would frequently lock Viore in her room, even though the door only locked from the outside. While Viore was out with her friends, Jeff would throw rocks at them as they tried to talk. At one point, Jeff was blamed for stealing items from local stores and would ride home underneath the town's buses. It got so bad that the bus company actually installed an electric trap under the bus in order to solve their problem. When James heard of this, he warned Jeff, who simply responded that he didn't need to worry since it was only on bus number 82. When James checked, he found Jeff was right. Activity continued, where it would follow the family to town, but it stayed out of eyeshot. But this all ended when the family decided to move. Sadly, this was pretty difficult, since many locals familiar with the story considered the house haunted, and in return they had to sell it rather cheaply. A man named Leslie Graham bought the house and reported in 1946 that after having many chickens go missing, he killed Jeff and skinned the creature. Leslie claimed the creature he killed was very old, but when pictures emerged showing it, it had black and white hair, which many were convinced wasn't the same animal. Prior to all of this, the family did produce evidence to prove their claims in the form of hair and plaster casts of footprints. Results of the hair came back saying it was simply of a sheepdog, which the family did have as a pet. As for the paw prints, they did come in various sizes, which is odd for one animal, but experts said the casts didn't show any signs of wrinkles that you would expect to see in an animal's skin or pads. They felt the prints were simply made by a stick. In other words, a hoax. So is that where we have to leave the story at? Possibly. But there are a few points that don't make sense. First, the family was quite poor, and yet they turned down an offer of $50,000 for Jeff to tour the United States, which Jeff again screamed that they'd put him in a bottle. Granted, they could have turned it down knowing it was all a hoax, but still it was around the same time period that Norman Jeffries from New Jersey was parading a kangaroo with glued-on wings for the public to see, claiming that it was a captured New Jersey devil. Even as such, without a world tour, the family were well aware that tabloids were willing to pay decent money just for their story, and many of them were turned away. At a much older age, Viore still claimed that the story was genuine, but refused to do interviews even though she could have made money from it. From what I read, the only money the family made from the story was the £5 that a psychologist named Nandor Fedor paid them for room and board while he investigated. What the family did gain was all of them were ridiculed and taunted by the community. It got so bad that Viore stated that she was never able to marry due to no one wanting to be tied to someone from the story of Jeff. Not to mention that they lost money when they tried to sell their haunted house. Even with all this, not a single one of the family claimed that the story was made up, including Viore, who died in 2005. She did state that she wished the events never happened to them, but she always stated that Jeff was very real. I can see where many, including myself at first, could see this as a 12-year-old girl with elderly parents trying to drum up a story to gain attention. However, much of the story doesn't make sense, such as her door locking, the urine through the cracks in the walls, moving heavy furniture, and her throwing stones at herself while talking to friends. So then my mind wanders, and I try to think what it could have been if it wasn't a hoax. Immediately, I align myself with a few of the investigators of the time, and that is, it was a poltergeist created by either James or Viore. This makes sense when people state many of the phrases used were similar to one James used, and that he was the one most interested in the activity. However, we can't rule out Viore being a preteen who was described as being very serious for her age, causing a poltergeist to manifest out of frustration, with her changes to her mentality and body during the teenage years. Even that theory doesn't cover all the encounters that were mentioned though. Touching back to something I said earlier, Jeff kept mentioning about being put in a bottle with much trepidation. This may be quite a stretch, but I have to wonder if it wasn't actually more in line with its first description, that it was a spirit, but maybe also a jinn? Granted, romanticized ideas of a genie in a bottle are not the same as the traditional jinn, but many stories about those beings tend to reference their fear of someone trying to capture them. Even as such, I could be injecting that theory, since the jinn are a being that fascinate me. It could have been a spirit that could take on whatever form it chose to. Since it showed a caring side towards their daughter, I could assume it would choose to take the form of something not so frightening, such as a mongoose or cat. I do have to question why the evidence presented were said to be misidentifications or an outright hoax. Playing devil's advocate here, I'm sure in the 1930s DNA testing of the hair wasn't possible. It was utilized in the 1950s. So I would assume the hair could just be compared visually. As for the casts, if this being was only presenting an animal form, it might only take a rudimentary one and not include the creases in the skin. Keep in mind, that is just my mind thinking outside the box. At the end of the day, this is quite an interesting story that offered way more things to discuss than I originally thought. So as I end this, I will quote Nandor Fedor, the psychiatrist who visited the family for a time and wrote a book on it. In 1937, he concluded, "Is Jeff an animal that talks? All probabilities are against it, but all the evidence is for it." Again, thank you to Billy Bonewhacker and Scyther Dracon for suggesting this topic, and I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this story? I can't wait to hear your theories on this humorous encounter. Also, I will be including a link in the description to the website for those patches from Monsterologist I mentioned in last week's video, in case you didn't get a chance to look at them before. I know a few comments didn't understand why I included a link to them, but the majority of you appreciated it. We are just doing our part to help out the small businesses during these uncertain times. Again, I receive zero compensation from the company for mentioning them. My fans know that already though. If you haven't yet done so, do please consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Also, it would be greatly appreciated if you share my videos with someone you know who may enjoy this type of genre. With that, be safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.